Rebecca, for organising this evening. And yeah, you and me might go back a long way. I remember I was at a wedding in North London, having a chat with you on the phone, and you and a crew from Father's House had gone down on a minibus to a Cheltenham racecourse, and it wasn't to put a bet on the horse. It was because of the Green Belt Festival, which year in and year out had excluded any speaker who had anything positive to say about Israel. But every year they were getting more and more hostile, and you shamed them. You were actually out there in the car park. And then I think also about the St. James's Church Piccadilly. If you remember that, again, you got guys coming all the way from North Wales to sit in that church and to make a stand because of what had happened there previously in the year. And for that energy and audacity, and if I call it chutzpah, I really salute you, because if only we had hundreds of fathers' houses around the country, believe me, we would be in a very different place. So I'm delighted to speak this evening. And just to add to that, Mike, I know that you've been to Yad Vashem and you've done the Holocaust education course there. And many people do that, Christians, Jewish people, and they get tremendous education. But my goodness, you take it so seriously in terms of the importance of passing that education on to others. And I know that you've done seminars online in recent times, and you're putting on a Holocaust memorial event this month, as you've done for many years. So you've really taken that education. I know you've had fantastic opportunity there. People like Professor Bauer, who's one of the world's experts on the Holocaust, taught you there, and you have really done your best to pass that knowledge on. So the subject you've asked me to speak about this evening is anti-Semitism after the Holocaust. And what an obscene title, really, when you think about it. That anti-Semitism should survive the Holocaust and indeed even grow and increase in our world today. And I want to start off by saying something that the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who very sadly died towards the end of last year, but he made the point, with using terminology which is so relevant to us, that anti-Semitism is like a virus, and it can mutate. It changes its nature to meet different challenges and scenarios. It's not necessarily the same thing, but it's there and it continues, and you can never really get rid of it. And he made the point that in the Middle Ages, the Jews were hated because of their religion. It was very much, and I know, Mike, in your education, you don't shy away from this, but the church in the medieval period was a vehicle for anti-Semitism, for hatred of Jews, for theological, all sorts of theological reasons. And then in the 19th and 20th century, when Europe has become a lot more secular and there's been a enlightenment, if you like, that kind of religious anti-Semitism was considered superstitious, it was frowned upon, but anti-Semitism doesn't disappear, it takes on a secular and pseudo-scientific guise. We come into the middle of the 19th century and there's a racial hatred of Jews. So it didn't matter whether that Jew had converted to Christianity, it didn't matter if he was entirely secular, an atheist. If you had Jewish blood in your veins, then you were the subject of anti-Semitic hatred. And the term anti-Semitism dates from the late 19th century, and it was a man called Wilhelm Marr, himself an anti-Semite, who coined the phrase that we still use today. And for Wilhelm Marr, the Jews were in competition with German culture and German society. And if the Jews won that competition, that rivalry, then German society would be destroyed. Therefore, it was essential for German society to destroy Semitism, if you like, the Jews, in all shapes and forms. Children, as I've said, Orthodox Jews, Reform Jews, didn't matter. It was their race, it was the blood that they carried in them. They were a dangerous force that endangered European and in particular German society. So you can see how that feeds in to Nazism in the middle 20th century in terms of a racist hatred for the Jew. But Lord Sachs made the point that after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism mutates again and takes a new form, where the focus so often is Israel, a hatred for Israel as the collective, if you like, of the Jewish people. And so this evening, I'm going to be talking about this new form of anti-Semitism that emerged after the Holocaust and which is still with us today. And if you want to talk about where did this anti-Semitism post-Holocaust, where did it thrive, where did it grow? You could talk about initially, perhaps in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, as part of a kind of a response to the Arab-Israel conflict. In the former Soviet Union, under Stalin, anti-Semitism grew. Stalin's own paranoia about the Jews, but also this infected thinking in the kind of hard left across Europe, and it's a legacy of that I'm going to touch on this evening. But it didn't die in Europe either, notwithstanding the horrendous example of the Holocaust. It's true that anti-Semitism couldn't speak its name in Europe. In other words, nobody, well, prior to the Holocaust, people could be proudly anti-Semitic and say, that's what I am. After the Holocaust, that became more difficult. So in some senses, it went underground in Europe, but also took on new forms. So in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, there were some positive developments, and I want to touch on them first before I look at anti-Semitism. And one of the kind of positive developments immediately after the Holocaust, I think, was in the churches, because I think the churches did, to some extent, recognize the contribution that centuries of specifically Christian contempt for Judaism and for the Jewish people, and how that had fed into a kind of a later racial anti-Semitism. And I'm thinking, for example, in the UK, we have an organization called the Council of Christian and Jews. It started in, I think, about 1944 as a very conscious attempt by the churches in England to try and address that issue and ensure that it wouldn't happen again. I would also raise the Catholic Church, which for many people is kind of the embodiment of a kind of a replacement theology, the idea that the church replaced Israel, and therefore a very fertile, I would say, ground for traditional Christian anti-Semitism. After the war, the Catholic Church rethought its basic theology regarding the Jews. There was something called Vatican II in the 1960s. The kind of liturgy, traditional liturgy about the Jews was changed as a result of its thinking following the Holocaust. So there were some significant developments within the church. And I think many people after 1945 really placed great store in international law and the United Nations and other kind of global organizations as being the means to ensure that the Holocaust could never happen again. And there was almost an optimism, if you like, around organizations like the United Nations. So what went wrong? Why are we talking this evening about a resurgent anti-Semitism? What is new about anti-Semitism? Well, I think we have to address something, and it's not in any way to say that traditional forms of kind of right-wing anti-Semitism still don't exist. Oh, yes, they do. And we have issues with skinheads, with far-right movements here in the UK. The National Front in the late 70s tried to make an electoral breakthrough, didn't quite do it. But there are other organizations out there with a kind of a racist agenda where anti-Semitism does exist on the right. But I think this evening we've got to address the fact that so much of this new anti-Semitism is actually on the left. And this is, in many respects, counterintuitive. And it's an anti-Semitism that doesn't recognize itself, because many of the people who indulge in it are committed in their own minds anti-racist. So how on earth could they be anti-Semitic? And it's rooted in organizations which you would think would be at the forefront of anti-racism, such as elements of the Labour Party, elements of the trade union movement, and also things like local authorities, which you think you would look to in order to protect minorities, also in kind of in the liberal world, where again, you think there's such a stress on tolerance and equality, but it's in these areas where this kind of new form of anti-Semitism exists. And we have to address the whole question of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and the relationship between the two. Because on the one hand, you'll get people who will say this whole allegation of anti-Semitism in the context of anti-Zionism is purely supporters of Israel trying to shut down any criticism of Israel. That's a point of view we've heard again and again in this country, particularly all the issues regarding the Labour Party prior to the last general election. But the Jewish community and its friends, and that means you guys, use anti-Semitism and weaponize it in order that people cannot criticize Israel. And then we're told that there's another extreme, which is to say that any criticism of Israel whatsoever is by its nature anti-Semitic. Now, personally, I haven't heard anyone ever say that, but that's also something which is sort of the Jewish community and its friends are accused of taking that line. And yes, there will be people who will shout anti-Semitism about things and about people which may not be genuinely anti-Semitic. There may be, you know, when I watch a BBC program that's unfair about Israel, or I read a Guardian article which is unfair about Israel, I react in an emotional way, and perhaps I accuse people of anti-Semitism when in fact their motivation is different. So where do we draw this line and say, yes, we are dealing with an issue of anti-Semitism in terms of some of those who are in the anti-Israel camp, and many of them, I have to say. Where is the continuity between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in its earlier forms? Well, I think firstly, you have to talk about demonization. It's one thing to hold a country or a government to account for its policies or its conduct. We do it all the time. And in the Israeli electorate or the Israeli media, they're holding their government to very critical account. That's one thing. But when you hold a country to be almost demonic, to be the exceptional evil in the world today, to take the view that without a state of Israel, the world would be a better place, then you're in a different place altogether than normal criticism. We might all be critical of the Chinese government and its human rights record, but we would never talk about China's right to exist as if that's a debatable point that we could have a discussion around. Whereas Israel, it's a different situation. There's the irrationality behind some of this criticism and the anti-Israel kind of movement, if you like. It's not rational to say that all the faults in the Arab-Israel conflict or in the Middle East generally, or imperialism globally, is all the fault of Israel. That goes beyond rationality. And I think that irrational element of it is a continuity of older forms of anti-Semitism. Often anti-Semitic terminology is used when anti-Zionists talk about Israel. So in other words, they'll talk about Zionist global control of the media, Zionist control of the banks, Zionist control of the governments. These are all classical anti-Semitic tropes, which are now being imposed. People aren't saying the Jewish people, but they're talking about Israel, but the terminology is clear. There's a history there, and this history is a continuity between older forms of anti-Semitism and elements of anti-Zionism. I would say that, and I've touched on this already, it's the existentialist, that's a big word I know, existentialist nature of anti-Zionism. In other words, they want the state of Israel gone. It's not about reforming Israel. It's not about making Israel a better place. It's not about changing the boundaries between where you think the border between Israel and a Palestinian state might be. It's Israel's existence which is being challenged and questioned. It's a desire to remove it from the world stage, from its existence. I would also say that the tactics often used by anti-Zionists for Jewish people bring back inevitably their fears and concerns dating back over their historic experience of anti-Semitism. The kind of boycott movement to isolate Israel, to remove Israel and its friends, so it is us as much as it is Israel, from civilized life. In other words, Michael, you mentioned Derry. It was actually Oma that I went to, by the way. It was Oma City Council, which was a similar scenario. The Derry City Council voted that to have me to speak at it would be an affront to the city of Derry. So somebody from a mainstream Jewish position is considered speaking to Derry City Council to be unacceptable. I've been no platformed by Derry City Council. And this is something that those in the anti-Israel movement would like to see across the board. That's their aim. Zionists should not have a platform anywhere. Zionist culture, Zionist academics, and they get to define who a Zionist is and isn't. So it's this tactic, if you like, of excluding people, taking them outside of what is civilized and acceptable, which I think is yet again a continuation of older forms of anti-Semitism, and why Chief Rabbi Sachs saw in our world today this anti-Israel movement having within it the seeds of a new form of anti-Semitism. And this has an impact on the Jewish community. So much has happened in the past year that perhaps we've forgotten the state that the Jewish community was in prior to the last general election. There was real fear in the air. I hadn't experienced anything like it in my lifetime, with the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister of this country. All sorts of statistics were bandied around that maybe a third of Jews were contemplating leaving this country in the event of a Corbyn victory. I don't know whether that would have happened or would not have happened. However, the fact that people were talking along those lines, and I'm not talking about a country in Eastern Europe, I'm not talking about France, I'm not talking about an Arab country, I'm talking about the United Kingdom. The Jewish community here are so well established, so much part of mainstream society, having made such a contribution over centuries, and people were contemplating having to leave this country. And that shows the impact, which I think was building up even before that. For me, I think a big watershed for many Jews in this country, you have to go back to 2014. If you remember, there was conflict with Hamas, between Israel and Hamas in Gaza in that year. And for the first time, I think the Jewish community became extremely unnerved by the extent of street demonstrations against Israel, by physical attacks on synagogues. A charity shop in London, I remember, being attacked. there was clearly a young and angry Muslim demographic that, whereas in the past, Palestine Solidarity Campaign demonstrations and events had been white, it had been people who had radicalized maybe in the 1960s, there was now a completely different look about the demonstrations, and many in the Jewish community felt scared. And at the time, I remember I was working with some of the main Jewish community organizations, the Jewish Leadership Council and the Board of Deputies, and they were getting a lot of criticism from rank and file Jews because they felt this was now their own existence that was being challenged here in the UK. And I can remember, so just to give you an example, a member of the Jewish community has a very senior job in the BBC, so he couldn't have been more establishment himself. And he said, Britain doesn't feel like home to me anymore. So this was happening in 2014 already. Jeremy Corbyn becomes leader of the Labour Party shortly thereafter. And we're in a whole new ballgame. The Jewish community had for, I think, previously tried to say that this anti-Israel element was relatively marginal, and pointing to their lack of success in getting actual boycotts implemented. And we didn't realize, I think, that in the grassroots, that there was this danger, potential danger. We saw an influx of this kind of hard left grassroots into the party, maybe other members of the Labour Party fed up with their traditional leadership looking for something different. And Jeremy Corbyn was the kind of savior figure who was going to bring something new and exciting and dynamic into the Labour Party. And for many of my colleagues in the Jewish community, particularly in kind of communal positions, very active in the community, they were coming from a Labour Party background. This was their party in which they suddenly felt no longer at home, a hostile environment, perhaps in their local branches, particular problems not far from you up in, and I know we have members of the Liverpool Jewish community here on this evening, terrible things happening in Liverpool to local Jewish MPs. So a real wake-up call, I think, not just for the Jewish community, and this is a really vital point to say, but for society at large, because where anti-Semitism is at work, where it's alive, where it's becoming mainstream, that is a sign of a society which has problems. And there was, of course, problems, issues around Brexit, for example, a very divided country, both sides not really recognizing that the other side had any validity. It was a very kind of strong debate, if that's the right word, a strong division that the country, a lot of people fearing the outcome of that. So there a lot of fear over immigration. A lot of things were bubbling away there, and it's no surprise when that happens that anti-Semitism will rear its head. I want to share with you some statistics regarding anti-Semitism in the UK, and then I'm going to stop because I really want to hear your comments and questions. You're very at liberty to challenge anything I've said if you don't agree with me, but let's have some discussion about it. But I want to share with you some hard statistics regarding anti-Semitism in Britain today. So back in 2017, an organization called JPR, which is a very professionally run research organization in the Jewish community, did an extensive survey about anti-Semitic attitudes in the UK population. And what they discovered was that hardcore anti-Semitism, and I'll explain what I mean by that, you're talking about maybe 2 to 5% of the British public hold hardcore anti-Semitic views. I'm talking now about Holocaust denial. I'm talking about people who say that they would consider violence to be something that they would like to see imposed towards the Jewish community. So we're talking about really hardcore attitudes. And if you think that 2 to 5%, well, how many people is that? That's 2 to 3 million, maybe. That's a bit frightening. That perhaps is still relatively small, but it's extreme. Beyond that, there's the acceptability of what I would call much milder anti-Semitic thoughts, perhaps. The idea maybe that, yes, the Holocaust happened, but the Jews exploit it to their own advantage. That would be one anti-Semitic sentiment, which is widely held, that the Jews think they're better than everybody else. Golf club anti-Semitism, you wouldn't want them to be a member of your club. That kind of snobbishness, a kind of offhand jokes, mild forms of views and sentiments. Well, about 30% of the UK population agreed with one or more of these kind of milder versions. Now, it's very important to say that means that 70% of the UK population doesn't hold any anti-Semitic view whatsoever, and that there are a lot of positive expressions regarding the Jewish community, which this survey also showed, that people appreciate that the Jewish community has made a contribution to British life in so many ways. So that shouldn't be lost sight of either, but two things: a small but very extreme hardcore, and the acceptability of anti-Semitic tropes widely in British society. And that could be people with a very liberal mindset, very tolerant, very into equality and stuff, but still holding views about the Jewish people, that they're distinctive, that they're dislikable aspects of their faith, that they're not, it's not confined to any one section of the community. The anti-Semitism on the right is still there, but it permeates different sections of the community. So that's attitudes. What about incidents? And we have an organization, many of you I'm sure will be aware of it, the Community Security Trust, and it exists to provide physical security for the Jewish community and also to research. So they will ask people to record anti-Semitic incidents. By no means is it 100%. In other words, a lot of people will experience anti-Semitism that they won't report it. So their figures are definitely underestimates. What they have shown year in, year out since 2014, which remember was the year I said was very much a kind of a turning point, was a spike in the number of reported anti-Semitic incidents in 2014, which at the time people attributed to the fact that there was conflict in the Middle East, and there'd always been a spike when that happened, when there was a lot of media coverage. But there was no downturn in 2015 or 2016. The figures remained high throughout and remain high to this day. The latest figures I can give you are between January and June 2020. The CST recorded 789 anti-Semitic incidents. That's down from the previous year. What lies behind that statistics? Violence is thankfully not major, but you're talking about 45 assaults, whereas in the previous year there'd been 85. Verbal assaults, not just physical assaults on the street, well, thanks to lockdown, they're probably not happening as much, that kind of street violence. But what we've seen, again, year in, year out, is the explosion of anti-Semitism on social media. And if we're talking about kind of modern anti-Semitism and its post-Holocaust forms, then social media has to be something which has kind of revolutionized the ability of anti-Semites to organize, to mobilize, to propagate their views over the last 20, 25 years. And that is something which is very high. And sometimes, I know locally to yourselves in Liverpool, local Jewish elected representatives have experienced online campaigns of anti-Semitism some of it of a very threatening nature, requiring police intervention. So social media, these incidents, a lot of it happening there. Desecration of property. Sadly, cemetery desecrations. I've mentioned attacks on synagogues, other Jewish properties. Still relatively unusual, doesn't happen every day by any means, but very upsetting. There's vandalism generally, but when it's targeted anti-Semitic desecration of a cemetery, I know this because it happened in Belfast, in my hometown. It's obviously very, very upsetting. Just then to finish on kind of trends or whatever, because of COVID, as I've said, perhaps less face-to-face anti-Semitism, more of it happening online. Some of the discourse is around COVID. You won't be surprised to learn there are people out there who genuinely believe that the Jews are behind COVID. That trope goes back to the Middle Ages and the Black Death and all sorts of illnesses to blame it on the Jews. Beyond that, this goes to show you the extent of it. That's people were saying that Israel, yes, of course, Israel would invent the vaccine because they invented the illness in the first place. So even if Israel had been the first to have a vaccine to save the world from this horrible illness, there would have been people there who said, oh, of course, because they devised the illness in the first place. So we're seeing discourse around COVID. That's a very current trend. Have I said enough? Have I depressed people enough? It's not a very jolly start to a problematic new year as it is, but perhaps one of the things we'll touch on in question and answers, if people want to know what they can do, how can they participate in the fight back against anti-Semitism, we'll be very happy to discuss that. But let's hear your comments, response, questions. Very happy to hear that and to respond as best I can.
Okay, if we
to share it, Mike, or
yeah, I'll stop recording now, Stephen. But that was an amazing presentation. Can you hear me okay now? Are we great?
Yep.
I guess everybody will. Vic's got his hand up, his hand raised. I'll stop the recording and then we'll start with questions.